A new wave of transatlantic economic friction is taking shape, one that could redraw the contours of global trade for years to come. On August 7, the European Union is prepared to activate a sweeping €93 billion counter-tariff regime targeting U.S. goods and services. This escalation is in direct response to the Trump administration's threat to impose a blanket 30% tariff on all EU imports unless a new trade deal is signed by August 1st. What began as a hardline negotiating tactic now threatens to ignite the most consequential tariff clash between Brussels and Washington since the formation of the World Trade Organization. The stakes are staggering. The EU and the United States are not just trade partners, they form the largest bilateral economic relationship on the planet. Combined, the transatlantic flow of goods, services, and capital exceeds €1.1 trillion annually. From Airbus parts and semiconductors to pharmaceuticals, spirits, and high-end machinery, the arteries of commerce connecting the two sides of the Atlantic touch virtually every major industry. Over 15 million jobs across supply chains, logistics hubs, research centers, manufacturing plants, and digital services are tethered to the health of this relationship. This isn't a dispute over marginal trade deficits or symbolic goods. It's a structural confrontation between two of the world's most advanced economies at a time when global supply chains are already stretched by conflict, climate shocks, and rising protectionism. What happens in the next few days may not just determine the tariff rate on European cars or American bourbon. It may set a precedent for how the West governs trade, investment, and industrial competition in a multipolar, increasingly transactional global order. The tariff mechanics at play in this standoff are far from simple. They reflect a layered negotiation process in which each percentage point carries enormous implications for revenue, market access, and political capital. The European Union's €93 billion countermeasure package is not a single blunt instrument, but rather a calibrated array of sector-specific tariffs designed to inflict economic pressure while preserving legal legitimacy under WTO frameworks. It includes two major components: an original $21 billion tranche targeting long-standing grievances, such as U.S. levies on European steel and aluminum, and a second, more expansive $72 billion list introduced by the European Commission in July. Combined, they target dozens of U.S. export categories ranging from heavy industry to high-margin consumer goods. Among the most consequential targets are U.S. aircraft and aerospace components. Boeing's annual exports to the European Union exceeded $42 billion in 2024, with wide-body jets and commercial aircraft parts making up the lion's share. If the EU's 30% retaliatory tariff is imposed, those transactions will face severe cost inflation, complicating transatlantic airline procurement strategies and potentially shifting some long-term demand toward Airbus, Europe's homegrown rival. The automotive sector also sits squarely in the crosshairs. American-made vehicles, already disadvantaged by high fuel consumption and regulatory divergence in the European market, would be subject to 30% import tax. That would hit major U.S. brands like Ford, Tesla, and General Motors, all of which have been lobbying against the tariffs, warning of declining market share and retaliatory job losses at U.S. assembly plants. The impact extends deep into agriculture, where European sensitivity to American production practices has long been a fault line. U.S. soybeans, among the most exported agricultural products to Europe, face renewed duties, while beef and poultry may be further penalized under quality standards clauses relating to hormone use and chlorination. American spirits, particularly bourbon whiskey, are also set to be targeted. This is a strategically potent move. Kentucky, the home of bourbon, is not only a critical swing state politically, but also a core node in America's cultural export economy. EU tariffs on whiskey would function as both an economic and political pressure point aimed squarely at the White House.
One of the more forward-leaning aspects of the EU's strategy is its preparation to extend tariffs or regulatory restrictions to the services sector. This is where the anti-coercion instrument, or ACI, comes into play. Though not yet activated, the ACI represents a legislative framework that allows the European Commission to retaliate against coercive economic actions by third countries with asymmetric force. If deployed, it could restrict U.S. digital and financial services providers from access to the EU's internal market, or suspend recognition of certain licenses and intellectual property protections. This would strike at the heart of Silicon Valley's global business model. Companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and Goldman Sachs rely on frictionless access to European markets for both revenue and data infrastructure. Any disruption in that access, even temporarily, would cause considerable volatility, not just in Brussels, but in stock markets and boardrooms in New York and San Francisco. This complex matrix of tariffs and regulatory tools reflects a new phase in economic statecraft. The European Union is not merely reacting to American threats with symbolic gestures. It is engineering a response architecture that is deeply integrated with the structural vulnerabilities of the U.S. export economy, targeting sectors that are both high value and politically resonant. This is not protectionism in the classic sense. It is an economic deterrence by design. The European Union's proposed countermeasures are not merely a symbolic response. They are a surgical strike aimed at the pillars of the U.S. export economy. The $93 billion package is built to exploit both economic leverage and political sensitivity, with product categories chosen as much for their trade value as for their domestic importance within the United States. This is retaliation by design, structured not only to match the magnitude of potential American tariffs, but also to apply pressure precisely where it will be felt most acutely in Washington, on Wall Street, and across the industrial heartlands. At the top of the list is the U.S. aviation sector, where Boeing stands as both a national icon and a critical node in America's advanced manufacturing base. In 2024 alone, U.S. aerospace exports to the European Union totaled roughly $42 billion. These are not low-margin goods. They are high-specification, long-cycle capital assets whose price sensitivity is considerable. A 30% tariff on aircraft and component imports would immediately disrupt commercial airline procurement plans across Europe, raising costs for buyers and potentially incentivizing a longer-term pivot toward Airbus, Boeing's European competitor. The result wouldn't just be a shift in aircraft orders. It would also affect the broader aerospace supply chain, from avionics systems and carbon fiber parts suppliers in South Carolina to precision machining hubs in Washington state. In the automotive sector, the proposed counter-tariffs come on top of an already existing 25% U.S. levy on European cars, a move that has been in place since the Trump administration first escalated trade tensions in 2018. The EU's response would mirror the logic behind that initial escalation, placing a 30% import tax on U.S.-made vehicles entering the European market. While U.S. carmakers already struggle to compete in Europe due to consumer preferences and efficiency regulations, this new cost layer would effectively shut the door on new market penetration for brands like Chevrolet, Jeep, and even Tesla. The longer-term effect could include strategic reallocation of vehicle production, disrupted dealer networks, and diminished R&D partnerships, particularly in the electric vehicle and autonomous tech arenas, where U.S. and European firms have increasingly collaborated.
Then there's the alcohol and spirits industry, where the EU has zeroed in on American whiskey, specifically bourbon, as a high-visibility target. Bourbon exports to the EU amount to approximately $1.6 billion annually, and while that may be a smaller figure in raw trade terms, its political impact is outsized. Bourbon is an emblematic export, tightly associated with U.S. cultural branding, and deeply rooted in key electoral battlegrounds like Kentucky and Tennessee. A 30% tariff on bourbon functions less as a trade barrier and more as a geopolitical message. Economic decisions have political consequences. Distillers, distributors, and even hospitality chains across Europe that rely on U.S. spirits will face higher costs and inventory instability, while American producers will find themselves squeezed by falling demand and tightening margins. Agriculture is another sector in the EU's crosshairs. Soybeans, one of the largest U.S. agricultural exports to Europe, have become a recurring focal point in trade negotiations over the past decade. The EU's agricultural market, heavily protected by both tariffs and phytosanitary standards, could be closed off further to American soybeans, poultry, and processed foods. Products like chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef, long controversial under EU import laws, may be subject to not just higher tariffs, but complete exclusion. The value here is dual-layered. These measures simultaneously punish U.S. agricultural exporters and placate European farming lobbies, particularly in France and Ireland, which are politically influential in Brussels. Perhaps the most forward-leaning component of the EU's response lies in its potential use of regulatory and non-tariff barriers, especially in the realm of digital and financial services. Though not technically part of the current tariff package, the European Commission has indicated that if negotiations collapse, it is prepared to activate the anti-coercion instrument. This legislative framework allows Brussels to impose retaliatory restrictions beyond goods, targeting American companies operating in Europe's tech and finance sectors. That includes firms like Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs, whose access to EU consumer markets, regulatory certifications, or data infrastructure could be delayed, restricted, or withdrawn altogether. These are trillion-dollar companies operating at global scale. The economic implications of such a move would be profound, rippling through capital markets, investment decisions, and even bilateral data transfer agreements like the EU-US Privacy Shield replacement. According to Olaf Gill, the European Commission spokesperson, these retaliatory measures are already on the books and could click into force within days of failed talks. This immediacy is no accident. It is meant to provide leverage at the negotiation table and to demonstrate the EU's institutional capacity for rapid economic retaliation. What makes this episode so different from past trade disputes is the layered sophistication of the EU's strategy, balancing legal justification under WTO rules, economic targeting based on sectoral vulnerabilities, and political signaling aimed squarely at Washington's centers of power. In short, this is not economic saber-rattling. It is a calibrated, comprehensive framework of escalation that, if triggered, will move beyond symbolic retaliation into the realm of structural realignment. Few European economies are as acutely exposed to the outcome of these transatlantic tariff negotiations as Ireland. At first glance, the country might appear to be a peripheral actor in a high-level confrontation between Washington and Brussels, but in trade terms, Ireland sits directly in the blast radius. The island nation has cultivated a deeply export-dependent economy, and at its core is one sector: pharmaceuticals. In 2024 alone, Ireland exported €44 billion worth of pharmaceutical goods to the United States. That figure represents not only over half of Ireland's total exports to the US, but also a critical component of its national economic engine.
The vulnerability is compounded by the structure of those exports. Unlike diversified economies with multiple industrial legs, Ireland's trade with the U.S. is heavily concentrated in a handful of high-value, high-margin pharmaceutical products, many of which are manufactured by American multinationals operating out of Ireland. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Eli Lilly, AbbVie, and Bristol-Myers Squibb all maintain large-scale production facilities in Ireland. These plants are not auxiliary operations, they are core production hubs for global supply, often taking advantage of Ireland's low corporate tax rates, skilled labor force, and EU single market access to optimize global logistics and profit margins. If the United States moves forward with a 15% baseline tariff on pharmaceutical imports from the European Union, as has been proposed under the terms currently being negotiated, the implications for Ireland would be nothing short of seismic. This would mark the first time in recent memory that the U.S. has imposed tariffs on medicines, historically a category exempt from such measures under long-standing norms of trade neutrality in healthcare. The result would be a sudden and substantial erosion of Ireland's export competitiveness in a sector where price sensitivity is high and margin compression can trigger cascading effects throughout the supply chain. Beyond the direct trade hit, the knock-on consequences for Ireland's broader economy would be severe. The pharmaceutical industry accounts for approximately 70% of Ireland's goods exports to the United States. It supports more than 50,000 direct jobs, many of them high-skilled, high-wage positions concentrated in manufacturing, quality control, bioprocessing, and regulatory affairs. Entire communities across counties Cork, Dublin, Sligo, and Limerick are economically tethered to the presence and performance of these firms. A 15% cost increase on exports would almost certainly lead to a slowdown in output, a reevaluation of investment, and potential job shedding, particularly if U.S. corporate headquarters begin to reconsider the cost-benefit calculus of keeping production in Ireland. The fiscal impact would be equally dramatic. Ireland's tax regime is uniquely intertwined with U.S. corporate behavior. American pharmaceutical companies have long used Ireland not just as a manufacturing base, but as a jurisdiction for profit booking, taking advantage of its 12.5% corporate tax rate and flexible intellectual property frameworks. This has made Ireland's corporate tax intake disproportionately reliant on a handful of large multinationals. In 2024, corporate tax receipts totaled roughly €22 billion, with U.S. pharma firms contributing a dominant share. Should tariffs lead to a reduction in sales volume, supply chain rerouting, or profit repatriation, the Irish exchequer could see a sharp decline in tax income.
This would imperil the state's budgetary balance, affecting everything from infrastructure investment to healthcare spending. Simon McKeever, CEO of the Irish Exporters Association, has warned that a tariff shock of this magnitude requires immediate intervention. He has called for the creation of a €1 billion tariff adjustment fund modeled after the Brexit Adjustment Reserve to help companies weather the potential disruption. The logic is simple. The economic environment Ireland faces now is arguably more volatile than during the Brexit transition, but the support mechanisms are not yet in place. Without targeted state support, firms may be forced to choose between absorbing losses, downsizing operations, or passing costs onto consumers.
There's also the geopolitical dimension. For years, Ireland has walked a tightrope, maintaining strong economic ties with the United States while serving as an enthusiastic member of the European Union. This delicate balance has brought enormous prosperity, but it also exposes Dublin to fallout when those two poles collide. If the EU moves ahead with countermeasures and the US follows through with its pharmaceutical tariffs, Ireland will be caught in the middle, paying the highest economic price for a confrontation it did not initiate but cannot avoid. What makes Ireland's position uniquely precarious is not just the volume of trade, but the structural dependency on an industry that could be dislodged by policy decisions made thousands of miles away. The pharmaceutical supply chain is agile but not immune to incentives. If U.S. regulators and trade officials succeed in tilting the cost structure in favor of domestic production, by design or by disruption, Ireland could face what economists call a reverse leprechaun effect, a sudden and outsized contraction in GDP driven not by real domestic decline, but by the strategic withdrawal of multinational capital. In economic terms, Ireland is not merely a participant in this trade dispute, it is a case study in the collateral damage of geopolitical brinksmanship. And unless a more favorable resolution is reached, the country could soon find itself recalibrating its entire export strategy under conditions of heightened uncertainty and fiscal strain. If economic diplomacy collapses, the European Union is prepared to deploy one of its most forceful and controversial tools of economic retaliation, the anti-coercion instrument, or ACI. While tariffs on goods dominate headlines, the ACI represents an entirely different class of countermeasure. It is not limited to discrete product categories or customs duties. Instead, it functions as a sweeping legislative authority that allows the EU to respond to coercive trade behavior by restricting access to its internal market in ways that reach far beyond traditional trade channels. At its core, the ACI gives the European Commission the power to target foreign governments or their industries through regulatory exclusion. U.S. companies operating in the digital and financial services sectors could find themselves abruptly cut off from public procurement contracts, denied licensing approvals, or stripped of intellectual property protections. This could effectively bar American tech giants such as Google, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft from critical components of their European operations, not through tariffs, but through legal and administrative isolation. The measure has not yet been activated, and there is little appetite among most EU member states to use it preemptively. But the instrument has been quietly gaining traction as a credible deterrent. France in particular has advocated for its readiness to be translated into action. French officials argue that unless the EU signals its willingness to escalate asymmetrically, it risks being boxed into a permanent defensive posture in the evolving architecture of global trade. By contrast, more cautious member states, including Germany and the Netherlands, have urged restraint, viewing the ACI as a nuclear option best kept in reserve, less a sword to be swung than a shadow to be cast. Still, its existence alone has already begun to alter the negotiating calculus in Washington. For U.S. tech and finance firms, the European market is not a luxury, it is an operating necessity. The EU remains one of the world's most lucrative regions for digital services, generating tens of billions in annual ad revenue, data monetization, and payment processing fees. Should access be disrupted, even temporarily, it would trigger internal reevaluations of business models, investor confidence, and long-term corporate strategy.
Financial markets have taken note of the growing uncertainty. The European Central Bank, which had previously been signaling a return to monetary tightening, has paused further interest rate hikes amid fears that a breakdown in trade talks could spill into the broader macroeconomic landscape. In its most recent meeting, the ECB cited elevated policy risk related to external trade relations as a primary reason for holding the benchmark rate at 2%. Officials made clear that they were in wait-and-see mode, with future rate decisions contingent on the outcome of trade negotiations with Washington. This policy caution has been mirrored in the private sector. Across the European Union, companies are freezing or delaying capital expenditure projects, especially in sectors likely to be caught in the crossfire: pharmaceuticals, automotive manufacturing, consumer electronics, and aerospace. According to a Deutsche Bank flash survey conducted in mid-July, nearly 41% of German industrial firms had placed strategic investments on indefinite hold, pending the outcome of trade talks. Among French exporters, the figure was even higher. The concern is not just about tariffs, but about regulatory fragmentation and supply chain reconfiguration. A 15% baseline tariff, if agreed upon, would be the most far-reaching redefinition of transatlantic trade terms since the formation of the World Trade Organization. While Berenberg Bank's chief economist has described this scenario as a lesser evil compared to the 30% cliff edge previously threatened, it still marks a substantial deterioration from pre-2025 conditions. For sectors that operate on tight margins and long planning cycles, such as semiconductors and biotech, even modest cost increases and logistical frictions can be the difference between scaling a European operation and relocating it elsewhere. Luxury conglomerates are also beginning to voice concern. LVMH chairman Bernard Arnault has publicly warned that escalating tensions with the United States could put core brands at risk. For companies whose sales depend on affluent American consumers, the threat of reciprocal tariffs or simply deteriorating sentiment can impact not only profitability but also share price stability and investor confidence. Meanwhile, institutional forecasts are beginning to reflect these risks. The International Monetary Fund recently revised its Eurozone growth forecast downward by 0.3%, citing disruption in cross-border capital flows, technology licensing, and investment due to sustained trade frictions with the United States as the key driver behind the adjustment. As investors, executives, and policymakers await final decisions out of Washington and Brussels, what remains is a deep and growing unease. This is no longer a debate about tariffs in the narrow sense. It is about the future architecture of transatlantic commerce. The most critical flows between the EU and the US are not just goods, they are data, services, capital, and intellectual property. If those flows are fractured, even partially, it will mark a historic turning point in Western economic integration. And that brings us to the strategic horizon. As negotiators scramble to reach a deal, three outcomes remain plausible. A finalized agreement with a 15% baseline tariff would bring temporary relief and market clarity, though at the cost of permanently higher trade barriers and the normalization of coercive tariffs. A collapse in talks would trigger the $93 billion counter-tariff regime, pulling both sides into a prolonged economic confrontation with knock-on effects for every major industrial sector. The third scenario, a phased compromise, remains the most technically viable but politically fragile, hinging on delicate carve-outs for steel, pharmaceuticals, and digital access that may be difficult to finalize in the compressed timeline remaining. What's clear is that the economic relationship between the United States and the European Union is undergoing a fundamental transformation. No longer governed by shared liberal trade norms, it is increasingly shaped by strategic calculation, sectoral bargaining, and geopolitical leverage. The trade war that was once dismissed as a rhetorical device is now playing out in policy, in spreadsheets, and on trading floors across the globe. Whether this episode ends in reconciliation or rupture, one truth remains inescapable. The global economic order is entering a new era, where trade is weaponized, alliances are transactional, and resilience, not efficiency, becomes the guiding principle of international commerce. For firms, governments, and citizens alike, navigating that reality will require not just adaptation, but foresight. Because in today's world, access to markets is no longer assumed. It must be secured, defended, and increasingly negotiated 1 percentage point at a time.